as usual, I use the term loosely. Good morning. Welcome back to my shop. Hey, have you guys ever, got a motor all cleaned up, got everything ready to go, gone to assemble it, slobbergopped up your mating surfaces with some kind of gasket snot, put it all together, tighten the bolts, and then found the rotating parts will go in here, don't rotate? Yeah, that sucks. Today, I'm going to show you how to make sure that never fucking happens to you again. And here's a little secret on how to avoid that ever happening to you again. Pre-fit, pre-test the engine before you put the gasket snot on there. That way if you do fuck it up, and you might, it'll be a lot cleaner when you take it apart. You won't get all gobble gobble with snot all over your fingers. Anyway, so we're going to test fit this motor here today. And we're going to start out by putting the sprocket shaft bearings in over there. Stand by. So here's the new bearing assembly. This was the matched Timken set. The double race, spacer, 2 bearings. These are all brand new. These should be correctly fit, but I have a little device I use for checking them just in case. And the device is no more than a little bit of an arbor and a piece of threaded rod. What I like to do on these things before I put them together in the engine is to just fit them over my little arbor assembly. The arbor keeps the inner races all aligned. Put a washer on it, a big washer, and a nut. Snug them up a little bit. Okay, this simulates the bearing being pressed on the shaft and tightened up. And you can see it spins freely. If that spacer was too small, you wouldn't be able to spin it, or if you spun it, it would bind. You should be able to feel just a tad of play in here. And maybe you could see it on camera. I got just a couple of thou of back and forth play on this one. This one's really nice. So, too loose is obviously too bad. Too tight is probably even worse. But anyway, I like to just check them. You don't have to do it now. You can wait until the engine's assembled. But then, of course, you got to take it all apart if you want to change the spacer. The match sets, I don't think I've ever run into a case where the spacer is incorrect. But anyway, I like to just check them real quick because, it takes literally a minute or two and it's not a big deal. So I'll get that out of the way. The other thing you got to be a little bit concerned about on these things is when the bearing is assembled into the engine, it's stacked up like this, and onto it goes the spacer which holds the seal. So when that's put together on the engine, it looks like this. The concern is I've run into a few of them where when you stack these things together, maybe due to variations in the width of the bearing race or variations in the spacer, you'll press this into the case, you'll put everything together, you'll go to put the spacer in, and guess what? The spacer sticks out too far and you can't get the snap ring over it. So what I do in those eventualities is I have an old one that's all jacked up, and I've ground the outside diameter off of it so that it just slides in and out of the fitting on the crankcase. That way you can put this all together. See if the snap ring goes in. If the snap ring doesn't go in and you got to take a little bit off, you could then take the spacer you're going to use and lap a little bit off of it, putting in a grinding wheel, put on a piece of sandpaper, whatever, and you might have to take a couple of 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch off of this thing so that you could get the snap ring in on the one side, the bearing race, the spacer, and the snap ring in on the other side. Anyway, that's how they stack up. I'm gonna walk this thing over to my press. I don't want to lose that. I want to walk this over to my press. I'll press this bearing race in, and then we'll put the bearings on the flywheels. So here's the inner double race pressed into the crankcase and ready to go. FYI, just a little about the oil system of the engine. Oil splashed around the inside of the crankcase, collects in this V-groove, is funneled into this hole. Inside the hole, it circulates around a channel on the back of the double bearing race, exits that channel through these little holes, which you may or may not be able to see, and those little holes are positioned so that they come out right in the middle of this bearing area, and that's how the rollers are lubricated. You know, no pressure, just splash. Arguably the most important bearing in the engine, and essentially we've got oil dripping on it from being splashed around in there. So this is one of the reasons I say on a Harley, oil pressure doesn't really matter that much. It's drip fed. As long as you've got good flow and oil is circulating, this bearing will get lubed. Not quite the same thing for the connecting rods, but for the sprocket shaft bearing and the pinion shaft bearing, that's how they're lubed. The oil's just splashed in there. So here's the flywheel with the inner sprocket shaft bearing race all goobered up, ready to be pushed on the shaft. If you saw the earlier video, you saw how the inner bearing race on the outer bearing was cracked and broken off because it looked like it got driven out with the hammer. This is the tool I use for installing these things without hurting anything. And it's nothing more than steel rings cut to different lengths. These happen to be an old fork tube. I keep an extra sprocket shaft nut laying around just for this eventuality, and then I just tighten the nut up and run the bearing down. And I run them down until the washer bottoms out on the shoulder of the sprocket shaft. Take the little one off, put a little bigger one on. Bottomed out. So this method pretty much guarantees you won't damage anything while you're putting the bearing on. And if you guys recall, I did that demonstration where I had these in the trimming stand. With hand pressure, I could deflect these flywheels. I think the last thing you want to do when you're putting flywheels together is to be, beating bearing races on with a hammer. I gotta think that probably will knock them out of true. I don't know for sure that it will. I haven't done that experiment, but that just does not seem like a very good idea. But anyway, this is what I do. Runs it down, doesn't hurt anything. Any old piece of pipe will probably work. Just make sure your edges are square. Okay, and that one's bottomed out. That's all it takes. This crankcase half is ready to be test fit. It is as good as I'm going to get it. All the welding is done. I did put one Healy coil in on a primary cover screw. It's as clean as I'm going to get it. All of the bolt holes have been chased. It's been blowing out, washed soap and water. It's as clean as it's going to be. There's nothing else that needs to be done with this. This is ready to be final assembled, and if things go well here today, I might press the outer sprocket shaft bearing on and run it down snug and have a flywheel and a crankcase half that's done and ready to go. Well, let's do first things first, and let's install a flywheel and make sure that it spins. And by install, I mean let's just drop it in the hole and see what happens. Okay, it's in there, and I always give them a little spin. At this point, it's not unusual to hear things rub because it'll tilt and it'll wobble. It's got some play in it. So this is laying here. The next thing we're going to do is measure and fit some pinion bearings. Pinion shaft bearings are available in 10,000ths of an inch oversizes, just like connecting rod bearings are. Basically, you use the same process. Measure the outer diameter of the shaft, measure the inner diameter of the bearing race, subtract those two numbers from each other, then subtract the 1,000th of an inch to get your clearance, then divide that number by 2, and it will give you the nominal size of the rollers. In this particular case, I came up with 0.187, which is the size of a standard roller. So we're going to put this whole thing together, see how it feels, and we should be pretty much very close in the ballpark. So let's install some flywheels. And by install, I mean let's drop them into the crankcase. Well, maybe not drop them. Let's place them into the crankcase. Okay. Okay, not rubbing, that's a good thing. Let's put the crankcase on and see what happens. Let's put a couple bolts in the crankcase and see what happens. And let's see whether the flywheels rub on anything. I hear a very faint scrape. Very faint. Right now, everything is against the left-hand side of the case. The bearing is tapered, and of course gravity is pushing the whole mess down. Let's stand it upright. I expect now that everything is going to shift to the right a little bit because the ramp on the bearing, it's the taper bearing, the ramp is going to push it all or let it all slide down towards the right hand side. Let's stand it up. Let's see what happens now. That is bad. Like I said, when it's standing, everything slides towards the right because it is a taper bearing, and that's the way the taper is going to let it go. I suspect if I could push it back to the left a little bit, see if it moves. It moves just a tiny little wee amount. And the rubbing is gone. Now just about gone. Now if I let it... Okay. I suspect when I put the outer bearing on and tighten it down, it's going to pull everything back over to the left just a little bit, and it should all be fine. But I don't know if I want to chance that or not. I don't know if I want to chance that or not. I'm thinking about it. Still thinking. On the old engines, the old Ks, and by old I mean the 50s era K and Sportsters, the sprocket shaft bearing race often had shims on it to push it one way or the other. I think I might shim this thing to the left a little bit. I think putting the spacer on the bearing and tightening it down might make it okay. But you know what? I think I'm going to put a shim in there. So here's the shim. It's not a big deal. You see these more on the 50s era engines than on the 60s or 70s eras engines. Why is that? I don't know. Harley had better quality control maybe, and there was more attention to detail, or maybe their processes improved and they thought they didn't need to check that anymore. I don't know. But I've seen these, and I have a few. Well, I might have like 2 more. That's about all I have left. I don't know if I could find these anymore or not. But anyway, I'm taking my installer, and I've given it a kind of a good thwack just to move the bearing race outboard a little bit. There are people who say all you've got to do is give the bearing race or give the bearing race a rack and move it outboard a little bit, and it'll be fine. And it probably will be. My concern, of course, is that over the course of use, heat, vibration, whatever, the race could migrate in, it could migrate out. Of course, if it migrates in, it's going to cause the flywheel to rub. So my thinking is, why don't I just prevent that entirely, install the shim, that way it can't move. It can't move inboard anymore, and it should keep everything from rubbing. So that's what we're going to do in this motor. And we'll put the snap ring back in on top of it. You know, and the flip side of this is, well, now that I've moved the race that direction, maybe the flywheel will rub on this side. Generally, you've got a little more clearance on this side than you do on the other side. So I'm going to flip this back over. I'm going to give it one more thwack to seat the bearing race against the snap ring on the opposite side. You know, you don't want to hit it extremely hard, because conceivably I could break the groove that the snap ring rides in and just, you know, drive the bearing race all the way out the other side. So you want it to be seated, but you don't want it distorting the snap ring and possibly causing it to fail. Okay, everything looks good in there. Let's drop the flywheel back in there. Okay, and it's not rubbing at all on the left-hand side of the case. We've just added about 15 thousandths of an inch, 15 thousandths of an inch clearance between this surface of the flywheel and the right-hand side case. The other area where they rub is right here on this retainer. and you could see the grease path, okay, and it's not quite touching the retainer. And what that tells me is that if I get this in here for you to look at it, is that the retainer is clearing this surface of the pinion shaft bearing race, which is a good thing. They do rub, and I do trim that retainer. And when I hear rubbing, that's usually the first thing I suspect. So this one's a little different. Let's put a couple bolts back in. Okay, 3 bolts in, snugged up. Let's see what happens now. It still rubs, but I'm not so worried about it now. Ah, here you go. Look at what we got here. See how much more free play there is from side to side. I don't know if you can watch this thing chuck over. Let me see if I can move it. That's quite a bit more than it was before. So when it's slid down, it's rubbing as I'd expect it to be. But now, when I tighten the bearing nut, the sprocket nut onto the outer bearing and pull the free play out of it, that's going to be fine. As a matter of fact, you know what? Let's go ahead and do that, because as far as I'm concerned, everything on the left-hand case is ready for final installation. Let's go ahead and put the bearing, the spacer, and we'll tighten it all up on that side, and we'll suck all the free play out of it, and I think this is going to be fine. Stand by, right back with you. Okay, let's put the outer bearing in. The spacer, this is a match set. Don't mix the spacers up with other bearings you may have laying around. Once you've got this free play set, believe me, too tight and you torque the big nut down, you will screw things all the fuck up. Too loose, this bearing will bang around in there, you'll screw things all the fuck up. Greased it with my red grease I've been using. Set that over the shaft. Go back to my bearing installation tools so I don't have to beat it on with the hammer. Good. Oh no, it didn't bottom out. Let's stop for the air compressor while it does its thing. Okay, air compressor is done doing its thing. This had not quite bottomed out. Yeah, there we go. Okay, now it's bottomed out. Let's break the nut loose. Okay, yeah, there's space between my spacer and the splines, so when it hit bottom, it was the bearing race bottoming between, or is the inner bearing races bottoming on the spacer between the two of them, not the big washer bottoming on the splines on the shaft. So now the crankshaft is hanging from the left side. It's in the most adverse condition it could be in as far as clearance with the right side is concerned. And you notice, what do you hear? Nothing. And that's what you want to hear. I don't know if you can pick this up on a camera. Let me see here what we got. Let me try to get you a little closer. and this is typical for Harley. If you could see in here, there is like virtually no clearance between the flywheel and the crankcase. Well, I say virtually no, there's some. You know, if the flywheels are trued within a thousandth like they're supposed to be, there's not going to be any wobble in them, and you won't have a problem. But I mean, you can't have mistrued flywheels put on one of these crankcases, because if you're out of whack by more than a few thou, you know, there's no room in there. The flywheel is going to hit the crankcase. So you know, you have to be running dead nuts true, or you're going to have problems. And this is normal. You know, there's not much clearance, but there has to be some. As long as you got some, you're probably okay. Let's stand these up and see what it sounds like. Now that's nice. That's what you're supposed to have. When I build these motors, every time I put two rotating pieces together, a camshaft, oil pump, whatever, I check and make sure that this is still the result. You know, a lot of guys build these engines. You know, I don't know what they check, what they don't check, but you know, to me, every step you've got to be very careful of what you're doing. You know, people say, oh, it's a Harley, and they think you could beat it to death with a hammer and beat stuff on and beat stuff off. Internally, these motors are fairly delicate. They're precise machines. You got to take care of them. But anyway, all those gyrations we went through, we're going to have another problem now. I'll show you what that's going to be. And of course, I forgot to zoom the fucking camera out, so you can't see what the fuck I'm talking about through any of this part. Anyway, that spacer that we carefully ground to fit under the snap ring is now going to be too fat. It's going to be too fat by the 12 thousandths of an inch thicker the shim was that I put on the right hand side of the bearing. So the whole gist of this is I'm going to have to run that spacer out to the lathe, machine about 12 thousandths of an inch off of it, and then stick it back in the hole so the snap ring will fit. That's it. Alright, so I'm back from the back shop. I just machined about 12 thou off of the spacer. I'm knocking the spacer in with a socket and a hammer. I'm not beating on the crank, so I'm not worried at all about knocking the crank out around. I'm just beating on the spacer, so I'm not hurting the crank in any way whatsoever. I will pop the snap ring in. Fits just right. Anyway, this part of this engine is done. The flywheel is permanently installed in the left crankcase half. I'm just going to leave it there. There's no reason to take it out. The free play is checked. The rotation is checked. Everything is free and clear. It doesn't rub. Spins nice and easy. For all intents and purposes, this crankcase is ready for final assembly. Except, of course, I'm waiting for the cam cover to come back from the chrome guy so I can line ream the cam bushings. I'm going to leave this all together until the cam cover shows back up again. We'll ream those bushings, and then we'll put this motor together. In the meantime, I am out of here. Hey, thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We'll see you next time. Have a good one. Bye.